Welcome back. Thanks for coming again to Art of Environmental Justice in an Expanded Field. We're about to head into session 2 with 3 artists, 2 of whom will present together, and followed by another sort of informal panel discussion where you all will have an opportunity to ask questions and make comments. Our next session begins with Teddy Cruz and Fauna Foreman, who both teach at the University of California, San Diego, where they've worked for many years now on cross-border urban dynamics in the San Diego-Tijuana region using architecture, environmental politics, social practice, and visual arts. Their collaborative, community-based research and activism promotes border immigrant neighborhoods as sites of cultural production, where policies about affordable housing and civic infrastructure can be reimagined. And I learned when they arrived that my introductory remarks are obsolete, so I'm going to rely on them to update you with the truth. But I want to make a few general comments about each of their remarkable dossiers of achievement. Fauna Foreman received her PhD in political theory from the University of Chicago. Her book, Adam Smith and the Circles of Sympathy, examines the ethical, spatial, social, and public dimensions of Smith's political economy. She has also edited Other Markets, a Reader, in 2015, and Amartya Sen and the Idea of Justice in 2013. A new co-edited volume titled Bending the Curve, 10 Scalable Solutions for Carbon and Climate Neutrality was published last year by the University of California Press. At UC San Diego, Fauna is the founding co-director with Teddy Cruz of the Cross-Border Initiative and is director of the Center on Global Justice. She's been involved with numerous other civic engagement projects in the San Diego area, including the Civic Innovation Lab, consulting with the city on new public space projects, and equitable urban growth. In collaboration with Teddy Cruz, she has developed exhibitions on social housing and cross-border citizenship at museums in Berlin and New York. She is vice chair of the University of California Climate Solutions Group and serves on the advisory boards of the Climate Neutrality Task Force, the UC San Diego Global Health Initiative, and several other organizations. Teddy Cruz is professor of public culture and urbanism in the visual arts department at UC San Diego. He and co-directs the Cross-Border Initiative, no longer the Blum Cross-Border Initiative, but the Cross-Border Initiative, which he co-founded with Fauna Foreman. Born in Guatemala City, Teddy studied architecture at the Rafael Landivar University, at California State Polytechnic University, and at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Before finishing graduate school, he was the recipient of the prestigious Rome Prize in Architecture in 1991 and became a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. Among his many other honors is the 2013 Architecture Award from the Academy of Arts and Letters in New York. In addition to teaching, running an architectural practice, and directing various programs at his home institution in San Diego, he has taught studios and seminars at universities in New York, Paris, Rotterdam, Barcelona, Auckland, and London, and by now, probably other places. He has also served as a special advisor to the mayor of San Diego on urban and public initiatives. His work in architecture and visual arts has been exhibited at museums and galleries around the world, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Istanbul Art Biennial, and architecture biennials in Rotterdam, Lisbon, and Shenzhen, to name only a few. The ongoing focus of his work is community activism and engagement. His series of political equator meetings involves what he calls nomadic urban actions with people oscillating across diverse contested jurisdictions in the Tijuana-San Diego border region, where social and environmental concerns intersect. Please welcome Teddy Cruz and Fauna Foreman. My pleasure.
Do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, no,
what do you want
this
to?
is fine. Yeah, that way you
Okay.
can be next to the computer. Thank you so much, Alan, for that introduction and for inviting us to be with you here today on a convergence of issues that are very close to our heart. So Teddy and I live and work in a zone of conflict and poverty that divides two cities, two countries, and indeed two continents. The US-Mexico border is just 30 minutes south of our campus, just minutes away from San Diego's mega wealthy suburban paradise. Sometimes people call it America's finest city. The border region where we live and work is both the largest binational metropolitan region in the world, and it also has more daily border crossings than any other checkpoint on the planet. The region is also a microcosm of all of the conflicts and deprivations that globalization has inflicted on the world's most vulnerable demographics. So in our practice, we work on a variety of conflicts that intersect in this region. First, political conflict, emblematized by a steel border wall that jurisdictionally divides a territory that shares many ecologies, and the infrastructure of surveillance and control that has been steadily thickening since 9/11. So political conflict and socioeconomic conflict emblematized by the dramatic juxtaposition of wealth and poverty in this region. And finally, economic and environmental conflict, where developer-driven agendas have turned San Diego into a model of oil-hungry urban sprawl, where the steel barrier wall undermines the environmental health of the region in ways we'll talk about today, and where climate change disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable people, primarily on the south side of the wall. So these conflicts are ubiquitous across the globe, from our own region to the Mediterranean to the Middle East. Border regions are amazing laboratories for artistic and cultural experimentation around issues of urban asymmetry, surveillance and control, citizenship and identity, regional interdependence, and environmental justice. And our unconventional political and architectural practice is deeply embedded in this region. So it's an embedded practice. We're based at a university, but we spend most of our time actually out in the field. And we'd like to share some of our projects with you here today. So the idea of climate justice animates much of our work. As surely you know, climate change is caused disproportionately by the production and consumption habits of the world's richest populations. The richest 1 billion people on the planet are responsible for about 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, while the poorest 3 billion, without access to affordable fossil fuels, are responsible for about 5%. In contrast, the bottom 3 billion suffer the greatest harms associated with climate change. And, you know, a powerful advocate for the convergence of poverty and climate as a kind of two-headed beast has been the Pope in his encyclical. And if you haven't read it, you must, but I'm sure many of you already have. This quote extracted from the encyclical, Laudato Si, is very meaningful for us. Today, he says, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So bringing together man's relationship with man's relationship to nature and to the earth. And so one thing that he really helped us understand is the history of human dominion over nature. Obviously, it has religious roots in Genesis, for example. Genesis Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and every other living thing that moves on earth. And of course, this religious conception of man's dominion was secularized in modernity, really the root of modernization theory, where the idea of terra nullius ruled, the idea that land that is empty, land that isn't being exploited, is being wasted. And therefore, anyone can come and put a fence on it, remove that territory out of the commons, and call it one's own property to the exclusion of others. So the Pope is drawing on this fantastic tradition, challenging it, and posing instead the idea of the earth as our common home, and thus an object of religious care, which is very, very powerful. But what he does, and what's so powerful about Laudato Si, is the way he links our irresponsible, exploitation of nature to the impact that it has on the world's most vulnerable demographics. UNICEF, just a couple of years ago, said that there may be no greater growing threat facing the world's children and their children than climate change. This mounting global crisis, they said, has the potential to undermine many of the development gains we've made in child survival in the last century. And so it's terrifying. The health effects of climate change, particularly on the poor, are predicted to become devastating by mid-century if CO2 and greenhouse gas reductions don't occur. Extreme weather events, air pollution, drought, floods, vector-borne disease, wildfires, degraded ecosystems are all linked to climate change, and the secondary social and economic effects multiply and cluster, obviously, in alarming ways. Now, and obviously, when these secondary effects happen, when land becomes unarable, when sea level rises, when things become hot, those with the fewest resources are least capable of both adapting to a changing climate, the capacity to adapt, and these communities are also least capable of mitigating climate and participating in climate action. And so climate justice is really seeking to balance harms and responsibilities. The harm that's being disproportionately produced and the impacts that are being disproportionately felt, and redistributing responsibility, obviously, toward the global north. Now, a key question for us in all of our work, and you'll see this sort of wind its way through everything, is we're always working on the environmental and the social simultaneously. For us, it's always about changing hearts and minds. It's always about changing perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors. And we've been really inspired by a lot of the focus group research that's been done over the last couple of decades, that if you want to change people's minds about climate change as a concept, and you want them to do something about it, you need to go local. People need to understand the direct impact of climate on their lives, in their neighborhoods, on their well-being, and their children. But secondly, people are more likely to accept the idea of climate change and to get involved if participatory opportunities for climate action are made available to them, where the real impact on their communities can be felt. So this idea of going local and drilling deep has really inspired all of the work that we're doing in our border region. For us, it's about changing social norms so that being environmentally irresponsible is no longer acceptable in the communities that we live in. And we've been inspired particularly by a figure who we'll talk more about later, who has a very interesting cultural methodology, in a way, for changing norms from the bottom up. But we'll wait for that.
Yeah. So we need to begin descending into the actual geography of conflict where we live and work, the actual context that has enabled us to push the retooling of our own practice as architects, as political theorists. And we can keep arguing to our own institutions, our own university, where we teach the need to localize the global, obviously, to get very specific in understanding and visualizing the particularities of the political, economic, and social, obviously, environmental dynamics at play in this border region. But obviously to also complicate local and global correspondences, as is unavoidable today, to understand that the wall is being walled, the world is being walled, and in so doing, I think, it's not only the protectionist sort of politics that have begun to erect walls all over the place. You can see here the main, not only physical borders, but the protocols that have really created this region of the world in terms of security, but also how in those regions we see the most dramatic of elements, I think, in this story, which is the unprecedented global social economic inequalities, the undermining of our social, environmental, and economic resources that have moved from the many to the very few. And I think that understanding that in this region of the world is where we have the 73% of the world's income benefiting only 14% of the world's population versus particularly the global south, where we find obviously 86% of the world populations with 27% of income. But also it is interesting to understand that in this disparity we find also how here is where we have the concentration obviously of green gas emissions that are ultimately affecting the poor in the global south. So I think that for us it's important to enable the, how would I call it, the sort of flying and walking simultaneously. We need to really constantly understand this interpenetration of local and global dynamics. But when we arrive to our own territory, to the specificity of this environment, that is, again, as Fona mentioned earlier, the largest binational metropolitan region in the world, truncated by a stupid border wall, it also obviously fragments the environmental assets that should be common to these two cities, Tijuana and San Diego. This is one of the main protagonists of our work, is the Tijuana River watershed system. 25% of it is in San Diego, 75% in Tijuana, but again, truncated, interrupted by this border wall. And you can imagine there is no intention or no initiative to manage these common resources collaboratively. And so this is the major hydrological system that ends into this point here, which is San Diego. But you can see these two figures here already, the two neighborhoods where we have been concentrating our practice in the last decade and a half. 2 points of entry, 2 communities, 2 marginalized communities on both sides of the checkpoint. San Isidro, which is literally the first immigrant neighborhood north of the checkpoint, and Laureles Canyon, which is a slum, an informal settlement of 85,000 people literally crashing against the border wall, and in between them, the Tijuana River estuary, which is the tip end of that huge binational watershed system, which now has been overlaid with militarization since 9/11, with Homeland Security being really transforming it into a military base. For us, it's important to begin here because it is in the immediacy, in the specificity of this very small area where we can find almost any imaginable topic for discussion today in rethinking not only architectural and artistic practices, I think, but at the center of any debate in the future of the city or of regions. Obviously, this is one of the most uneven urbanizations in the world. As if we were to do a dynamic map of the way that San Diego and Tijuana have grown in relationship to each other in the last 100 years. Even though San Diego and Tijuana now have the same, approximately the same population, San Diego has grown 6 times larger than Tijuana. So it really confronts us with this incredible conflict between irresponsible sprawl and density. Dramatic inequality, obviously social and economic inequality is reproduced in every city in the world today, but here between some of the wealthiest real estate in the world, as the one found in the edges of San Diego, barely 20 minutes away from some of the poorest informal settlements of Latin America, as the one found in Tijuana, we see this radical proximity of wealth and poverty dramatized in incredible ways. Obviously, the militarization and surveillance of the territory is here emblematized by the, in fact, by the militarization of the environmental zone by Homeland Security in the last years. The impact of migratory flows, not only migrants today seeking the strong economies of the global north, but primarily also environmental refugees. I think the shifting demographics of the American city has been an essential topic. Again, and the impact of immigrants in the transformation of the American neighborhood. Again, what I'm introducing is basically that in less than a 2-mile radius, we find all these issues, and their specificity is what we should, again, reorganize our research agendas, our practices. The politics of outsourcing, obviously Tijuana is one of those tax havens for multinationals to come and set shop and take advantage of cheap labor without respecting environmental laws and labor policies. And finally, the challenges of informal urbanization. A lot of our work is really devoted to understanding the capacities of informal densities and economies in transforming top-down policy. San Isidro for us is the point of entry in understanding the tactics and strategies of adaptation by immigrants in transforming the homogeneity of San Diego's sprawl in terms of alternative uses and zoning. And then Laureles Canyon is our point of entry, this informal settlement of 85,000 people, in understanding the potential of informal settlements as laboratories for rethinking environmental infrastructure, because these places are really built by bottom-up, let's say, capabilities. But what has been important for us, again, in this sort of zooming in and out, right, flying and walking simultaneously, is to argue that from the political specificity of these two marginalized communities on both sides of the border, we can begin to also push at the reimagining of global governance. So this is when we discovered a few years ago that San Diego, that really the world's most contested borders are clustered along the same corridor of global conflict between 30 to 38 degrees north parallel. Including obviously our own Tijuana-San Diego border, which is the main funnel of migration from Latin America into the United States, but also connecting to Fortress Europe, the border at Ceuta and Melilla and the European Union, which now has been thickened in the Strait of Gibraltar, also the Israeli-Palestinian border, the India-Kashmir border, and finally at the other end of this corridor, the South and North Korea. This is what we ended up calling the political equator, as a way of entering into the complicated relationship between the political, obviously, and the environmental. But for us, was also a way to zoom into the territory back again, to get deeper into the understanding the relationship of these protagonists in our embedded practice, these two neighborhoods, and at the same time really visualize the relationship, particularly, which is what we wanted to share with you, between this informal settlement, the border wall, the estuary, and Homeland Security is now 200-foot wide band of jurisdiction. It is here where we find an incredible example of what we mean by the visualization of conflict and the specificity of these sites where the collision of ecologies really becomes incredibly dramatic. So this is a place where the tsunami of informality from Mexico literally crashes against the border wall. In the distance, we find the Tijuana River estuary. So this relationship, this conflict between the informal settlement and the protected environmental zone, which is the Tijuana River National Estuary and Research Reserve, has been at the center of our work, mainly because after 9/11, Homeland Security began to build the second border wall in the shape of these berms and concrete walls with drains, but only to exacerbate the flow of waste from the informal settlement contaminating our precious binational, environmental asset, which is the Tijuana River estuary. So we've been arguing that as the American public is sold the idea of the wall as an artifact of security, we have been gathering evidence, obviously, that that very artifact becomes the instrument of environmental insecurity that will eventually produce social and economic strife. So this has been the intersection that we've been entering to open these discussions and enable a very different idea of public space. We negotiate, the political equator became meetings where we summon a variety of stakeholders that are involved in these conflicts, and they require very arduous and masochistic permits to really have access to this forbidden zone. So we negotiated with Homeland Security in the organization of the political equator 2 years ago, where we entered into this 200-foot of jurisdiction to set up a public space where we summon Homeland Security, community activists, scholars, politicians. In fact, the two offices of the two mayors from both cities were there, barely a few feet away from the new border wall, to really open up the discussion. In our work, many times we use physical models and visualizations to really expose the conditions and really produce, in a way that maybe Chantal Mouffe has inspired us all, I think, in a more agonistic model of how to intervene in a more productive way into the debate by confronting institutional power. So these discussions, which involve a variety of stakeholders, are important for our work, precisely embedded in the drama of these geographies, of these landscapes of conflict. These are nomadic conversations that really traverse the territory. But the most amazing possibility that emerged in this particular event is that we requested a special permission from Homeland Security to transform a new drain that had been recently built by Homeland Security into an official port of entry for 24 hours, so that we could enable everybody to visualize as we moved through the drain, moving from the pristine estuary that has been contaminated into the slum on the other side, because nobody really recognized the relationship of those two environments. So this is how, from the tent, we proceeded in an unprecedented way to cross the border through this border drain, again transformed into an official port of entry. All of us, 300 plus people, were carrying our passports. Homeland Security said, well, you can do it, after realizing that we were actually exiting the US and not entering. But they said you have to negotiate with Mexican immigration so that they wait for you on the south end of the drain to stamp your passports. And that's what happened in order to make this possible. And while people were being stamped their passports, they could witness the sewer and waste that was flowing from the informal settlement to contaminate the estuary. So in many ways, our interventions is really are about visualizing these conditions of conflict and summoning, again, a cross-sector debate. Major conclusions in terms of this meeting of the political equator, our third one really in the region, is obviously that this political equator corresponds with the climatic equator, and that we cannot open any conversation about global governance or these issues without understanding really the specificity of the conflicts between geopolitical borders, marginalized communities, and natural resources. I think that intersection really should define our conversation in years to come. But also the fact that as we were moving through the drain and exiting into the edges of the slum, that we needed to really begin rethinking, obviously, political borders through the natural boundaries that are shared between these two cities. And finally, the most important provocation of our experiment was the provocative question, is there really a cross-border citizen? You want to?
Yes, so an idea, we wanted to open up the idea of citizenship. Is there an idea of citizenship that can be oriented around shared purposes and aspirations regionally? So an idea of citizenship that strikes against the sort of conventional jurisdictional concept that card-carrying concept that we usually
sort of
use.
An idea of citizenship beyond the nation state, I think, was fundamental for us.
So for us, the most inspiring ideas of citizenship had emerged from urban experiments in Latin America over the last several decades. So we were particularly interested in a tradition of participatory urban interventions across the continent that produced fantastic green infrastructure at the same time as producing new modes of civic participation. And for us, Bogota and Medellin, Colombia, have been the most emblematic. And we want to say a little bit about Bogota, which of course in the last couple of decades became very well known for its advanced multinodal transportation system, which became a model for cities everywhere, with a very sophisticated BRT linked with bicycle sort of pathways and so forth. But the story we want to tell actually happened before the BRT succeeded in Bogota. This was Bogota in the 1990s. In many ways, not any different than our border region at certain moments in our own history. A site of dramatic poverty, violence in the streets between drug cartels, paramilitary, guerrillas and police, a scene of urban repression, complete urban breakdown. The city was literally falling apart. And it was at that moment that a very imaginative mayor, a philosopher actually, rector of the University of Bogota, became the mayor of the city of Medellin in the late
Bogota.
Bogota in the late 90s. And he came with a very new idea about how to intervene. Instead of the conventional tactics of law and order that, that mayors and national leaders use all the time to counteract poverty and violence, he came instead with street mimes and what he called citizenship placards, and a very new idea about how to change the city from the bottom up through arts and culture interventions. So basically, what is the next slide is? So he conceived of this idea of citizenship culture, and this is really what was very compelling to us. He wanted to understand how to reconnect citizens with one another in the city of Bogota. That was first. Before any kind of top-down intervention through policy or infrastructure, you had to figure out how to reconnect citizens to one another. So the very first thing he did when he took office, very unconventional, and people sort of thought it was silly in a way, but he distributed a thumb on a placard by the tens of thousands to everybody, and he encouraged people as they were moving through the city to use the thumb to demonstrate approval and disapproval toward one another. So if somebody did something that violated your sense of civic dignity, you'd hold up a thumbs down, and if somebody did something pro-social, you'd hold a thumbs up, and it created this sort of joint attention, and everybody was sort of using them and looking at each other, and very slowly, without realizing it, through this reciprocal performative gesture, they were deciding together what kind of city they wanted to live in. And slowly, through this gesture, they began to build public trust. There's much to say about the way Antanas framed his administration. I mean, he believed deeply in top-down public investment, but he also saw the city as a classroom. So he took a very sort of the idea of urban pedagogy. He actually, there's this wonderful quote. He said, "As mayor, I assumed a fascinating pedagogical task, learning and teaching in a community of 7 million people. I decided to confront the culture of the city, the languages, perceptions, customs, cliches, and especially people's excuses." And his impact was really impressive. I mean, he obviously brought on a lot of criticism because he was doing something very new. But look at the impact just in Antanas's first term. He served 2 terms. Water usage in the city of Bogota decreased by 40%. He engaged in all sorts of public communication campaigns about the need to reduce water. Homicide in the city reduced by 70%, traffic fatalities by 50%. He extended water and sewer services to nearly all households, and tax collections in the city nearly doubled, and the wealthiest class were actually paying more than their share. So he was very successful in reattaching citizens to one another and enabling the kind of interventions and transformations that took place. So we've taken 3 important civic lessons from Bogota back to our own region. 1, Before transforming the city physically, you need to transform social norms. You have to start with behavior from the bottom up. 2, it's much better to fight violence with community process than with law and order. And he has this wonderful idea that law and order, it may stop behavior, but it doesn't interiorize, that's his word, it doesn't interiorize new values. It has to come from within. And he believes that arts and culture are the most powerful way to do it, the most powerful way to disrupt harmful social norms. So after Antanas left office, very successful terms, he developed a nonprofit in Bogota called Corpo Visionarios, and they consult cities across Latin America on how to intervene into citizenship culture. And it always begins with what's called a citizenship culture survey. So it's a survey designed to measure 2 things in a city: public trust, what you might think of as the vertical relation between publics and various institutions, the municipality, the military, university, the church, and so forth. But it also measures what we might think of as horizontal or lateral capacity within a city for collective action. And so it became this fantastic sort of device that's been used now in 50+ cities across the continent. Well, we got a grant from the Ford Foundation, and we asked Antanas to come to the border with us to help us think about the idea of a citizenship culture in the region of San Diego and Tijuana. And he loved the idea of thinking about citizenship in a region like ours, because in Latin America, in all these cases that we found so interesting, citizenship was always a way to bring people together, to organize what's disparate. Whereas in the US, citizenship is used as a divisive tool to separate us from them, what's mine from what's yours, and so forth. So he loved the idea of doing this with us. So we designed what was called the Cross-Border Citizenship Culture Survey. And it was a sophisticated piece of social science to really measure what we share in this region, things that actually go below the radar. Borders can't contain many flows, environmental, economic, cultural flows. We wanted to illuminate what it is that's invisible in this region, particularly the environmental. So we convened a cross-sector group. We wrote this survey. We deployed the survey. Here we are actually brokering a meeting between Antanas Mogus and the mayor of Tijuana. And we'll show you how enthusiastic the mayor of Tijuana became when we showed him the results. We got the data back. It did exactly what we hoped it would. It demonstrated that indeed there are interests and aspirations in this region that are off the radar of the policymakers. We found a basis for trust between these 2 publics. These are 2 cities that looked away from one another. We found a basis for trust, and we found a desire among publics on both sides to work on a whole variety of public policy issues, and environment was key among them. So this is a letter from the mayor of Tijuana after the survey was done. It's a letter from the mayor to the Ford Foundation. And he says, the survey is a powerful tool that enables us to identify our strengths, challenges, and opportunities as a city and as a bi-national region, this regional sensibility. The most exciting result of the survey is that majorities on both sides of the border are eager to work together to improve quality of life for all. So this was very inspiring to us. At a time when the border, again, is a site of, being criminalized in public discourse, what the survey does is it recuperates the idea that this is a region ripe for interdependence and collaboration. And actually, there's a history of this in our region. Actually, in the 1970s, the well-known urbanist Kevin Lynch came to do a study of San Diego, and he wrote this fantastic report called Temporary Paradise, ? Calling on Milton's idea that things don't always last forever, and if you continue the way you're going, you're not going to last forever. And his key insight was that the destiny of San Diego relies on the destiny of Tijuana. He said these cities are intertwined, and he did these wonderful hand drawings where he conceptualized, he imagined the region as existing without the cities, right, as just a system of canyons and watersheds, right? It was very provocative. And he actually, out of this, produced a diagram that became very important in our practice, asking us to understand the relation between what he called the natural and social gradients of the region. So can we imagine a border that would actually respect, you know, the topography and the natural systems of this part of the world? So instead of a flat line, it would be a line that bends and curves along the natural gradient from mountains to valleys, mesas to the ocean. Similarly, the north and south gradient, which represents inequality and disparity in the region, can we find a way to flatten it? And for Teddy and I, the juxtaposition of these two gradients is really the future of the region.
And by the way, I mean, we're rushing through hugely complex processes, and I hope that you realize that our performance of the cross-border citizen as a question is what took us to Antanas. We brought him, and I think it's emblematic of our practice that we're interested not only in physical systems, but also in the designing of protocols that can really reorient urban policy and really a very different conversation. But what is interesting in our recuperation of Kevin Lynch's manifesto of sorts, which is really about interdependence already in the 70s, is that he connects beautifully the idea of citizenship to visual cognition of the territory. He argued that if we were able to actually draw a sketch of the region where we live, and we're able to name all the rivers, all the sort of geographic and landscape or ecological elements, that would make us a citizen. You know, the closest we are in the recognition of those conditions. And he created a series of workshops where children, university students, were asked to really draw their region. I think that this is fundamental in the last piece of our presentation, because we believe that what defines the political dimension of a community is really not only the recognition of that immediate environment, but the dialogue it has with it. And obviously, for us, then all of this converges into the most recent project that we've been advancing in rethinking the relationship of our own university and the communities that we work with. How to co-produce knowledge at the Tijuana-San Diego region. Obviously, the project here is one of urban regional pedagogy, in a sense. How do we rethink the relationship between universities and communities, particularly, so that we can move from a vertical relation that is often really what organizes these conditions, obviously through charity or just understanding communities as subjects of analysis, but never really as partners in co-producing knowledge. So the bending from the vertical relation to a more horizontal, we find to be the most ethical move that we can make today. How do we, again, enable this relationship? So we created what is called the cross-border community stations model as part of, in terms of our university. Which basically produces a new form of partnership between university and community. We argue to our chancellor that communities and universities really could be meaningful partners in tackling climate change and inequality. And because we argued both universities and communities have resources and knowledges to contribute. I think the linkage of specialized knowledge of universities with the creative knowledge embedded in these communities, obviously environmental activists, social activists, and so on, is fundamental here. So the community stations became an infrastructure system of field hubs located in those marginalized neighborhoods that we work with, where teaching and research is conducted collaboratively. And this is very particular research and teaching pertaining, obviously, climate action, but also urban infrastructural sort of capabilities. There is much to say about this project. We need to wrap up, but suffices to say that what we've been trying to do is to design unorthodox programming inside our university with our community partners, because it's truly a kind of collaboration, again, arguing, just like Antanas would say, that the crisis today is one that is cultural, a crisis of knowledge transference. How do we facilitate the bottom-up knowledges embedded in these environments to trickle upwards in the transformation of top-down policy? So in a sense, we've created a collaborative education and research platform where we circulate students, researchers, activists. One particular program that has been incredibly difficult to achieve, but we did, is to create a program that is called Public Scholars, where we actually give stipends to environmental activists and social activists in these communities to come and spend time, meaningful time with us in the university, people who do not have credentials to teach in a major research university, but they come facilitated by us to enable the co-designing and the co-production and the co-curation, let's say, of education with us. You know, many of these activists, they are just expected to volunteer, and we argue to the university they need to be paid as many of us professors are paid as well. So I think this idea that we were not only enabling the specialized knowledge of the university to elevate the capacities of communities, let's say, for political action, for us was equally as important to bring their knowledge inside the university to reorganize our research agendas. But the discovery that was essential to us was that this one was not only an interesting sort of reciprocal knowledge project or platform, but became for us a very interesting model of shared urban development. In other words, we presented the possibility that the community and the university could be co-developers of new spaces that educate. This is really about rethinking public space as a space of education. An example of this is that one of our partners in one of the community stations, Groundwork San Diego, which is an environmental justice nonprofit that is devoted to really issues of K-12 informal learning through environmental literacy and participatory climate action through community engagement, that we were partnering with this entity that has already capacities to summon 2,000 plus children and their families to move through these environments in these marginalized neighborhoods, but that because of our partnership between, again, the university and the nonprofit, we were able to convince the school district, the Unified School, San Diego School District, to give us a 4-acre piece of land, a vacant site. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that these partnerships produce, again, this possibility of to have access to public lands to transform them into public spaces that educate. So we are working now, this is very recent as a project, in the transformation of these 4 acres into a 4-acre open-air environmental classroom equipped with community gardens, with water and energy conservation infrastructures, etc. This is a project that we are going to be developing, again, in collaboration with the university, because, again, the economic power of the university and its programming became equity for the community agency, but also enable a political representation of support to have access to the management of this amazing piece of land. Here we are with some of, many of us, I imagine you who practice in the world of art or culture, you know that we become cultural brokers somehow across fragmented institutions. So here we are with Robert Rashed, who has kindly supported these agendas, with the community that we serve, with the nonprofit leadership, presenting the possibility of this, again, development of this master plan. But what became incredibly powerful, and I guess we're just summarizing and rushing so much this information, is that we discovered, obviously, that this piece of land is surrounded by 6 public schools that are not in communication with each other. So we presented not only to the local school district the potential of transforming this piece of land into an extended classroom devoted for participatory climate action in the community, but also we approached the state of California, where we created a coalition to suggest that this environment, this public space, could be the epicenter for what we ended up calling a zero-net energy community. This is part of a new program that Jerry Brown has really advanced in our very, we are lucky to live in California at this moment, progressive state.
Can I just say one quick thing about this? So UCSD is a world leader in energy storage technology, and one way we've been working with the communities to figure out how to mobilize that, that expertise into the neighborhoods in Southeast. And the California Energy Commission supported this with a planning grant that has the potential of a huge second phase in about a year.
So we were basically chosen to be one of the pilot projects with a $2 million grant to do a planning.
Microgrid, essentially.
In the community. So Earth Lab then became a larger scale project of really reaching out to the fragmented schools, the different multi-housing projects, and the business community of this small environment. And finally, across the border, again, there is no time to really go deep into the development of these environments where we co-produce teaching with our partners. But the other partnership has been with Casa Familiar, which is a nonprofit organization devoted to social organization, affordable housing, and public space in those neighborhoods that I showed earlier, and really has enabled us to join forces in producing research in the last decade and a half on the impact of informal urbanization, immigration, and citizenship, and to really begin to tackle cross-border urban and environmental policy. So let me just, let us finish with the production of the community station in the informal settlement of Los Laureles, where we have been more intentional, let's say, in elevating this idea of how do we, as a region, as a bioregion, research new strategies of coexistence. In essence, how do we look at the informal settlement of 85,000 people in relationship, obviously, to the estuary? They need to be understood as a continuous system. This is really the essence of our work here. So we began conversations with the municipality in Tijuana to give us access to a series of slivers of public lands across the trajectory of this canyon, of this informal settlement, so that we can begin to develop them with our students, researchers, and others, obviously our community partners, into public spaces that are pedagogical in nature, but can also double as water and waste management facilities. I think this hybridity or this sort of promiscuity of systems that are so defining of these informal settlements is a huge lesson for us. So this idea of developing public spaces that operate, again, as social nodes, but also as water and waste infrastructure before that waste reaches the estuary. And at the same time, we've been very much continuing to research how these slums of Tijuana build themselves with the waste of San Diego. So, and at the same time, obviously, they are surrounded by multinational maquiladoras where cheap labor is extracted from these environments. So we've been interested in understanding the temporal sort of dynamics of construction by people and their capabilities in these environments. Again, to suggest that it is this what could give us the DNA for reimagining environmental infrastructure across time. And this is what has inspired the construction, or at least the planning, of our community station in the informal settlement, as we have layered a variety of programs inspired by our partnership with the community and the university, from citizens science to arts and culture programming, to small incubator spaces for incentivizing local economy and so on. So a kind of the idea that architecture could be pedagogical in nature, that it is transparent of its complex social and economic programs. And this is then now to end probably what has been moving our practice in fundamental ways, the idea that public space cannot continue just being a space of beautification and neutrality. This is something that we tend to do, I think, a lot in our conversation in terms of urbanization in the United States. But learning from Latin America has been essential, where public space has been understood as a space of education, where knowledge is constructed, and that is not only a physical space, but is injected with cross-sector coalitions to inject funding, curation of programs, and partnerships that make those spaces sustainable in the long term, to equip public space, basically, with new tools to build a community's capacity for climate action. I think that, for us, represents the future. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Teddy and Fana, for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Lucie Orta. Trained as a designer, she began experimental practice in 1992, exploring boundaries between the body and architecture, social interactions, communication, and identity. Since 2002, She has been a professor at London College of Fashion and currently is Chair of Art and the Environment at the University of the Arts, London. In collaboration with her spouse, Jorge Orta, Lucie's practice focuses on ecological issues, employing sculpture, installation, couture, painting, silkscreen, photography, video, drawing, light, and performance. Is there something she doesn't do? The Orta studios are located in London, Paris, and Les Moulins, a cultural complex outside Paris founded by the artists, dedicated to artistic research and production informed by the environment and the industrial heritage of the region, including the former mills and paper production that once occupied the valley. Lucie's collaborative work has been exhibited at hundreds of museums, galleries, and events around the world. Key themes in her work include local and global food chains, community dining rituals, portable habitats bridging architecture and dress, alternative modes of establishing social links, biomedical ethics of organ donation, water scarcity, and problems arising from pollution and corporate control, as well as the human impacts of climate change. In recognition of their contribution to sustainability, Lucie and Jorge Orta received the Greenleaf Award in 2007 for artistic excellence with an environmental message, presented by the United Nations Environment Program in partnership with the Natural World Museum at the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo. Her work has also been featured at many prominent public art events, including Biennale exhibitions in Venice, Rome, and Shanghai, as well as the Grand Palais exhibit during the COP21 UN Climate Conference in Paris. Please join me in welcoming Lucie Orta.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Alan, for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to repeat some of it. Not too much, I hope. So to begin, Alan mentioned Les Moulins. This is a project that is occupying a lot of our time at the moment. And we arrived in the region, it's 30 miles east of Paris. We arrived in this region looking for a studio space to expand our practice. And we found up here the La Laiterie, the dairy, which is the first modern dairy, the first industrial dairy in the region. It's actually in the Brie, so as you know, cheese. There are no longer any cows there, which is significant. And all of the deindustrialization here, these are the paper mills that are along the river. This is the Grand Morin River. And a lot of these mills and factories, some of them dating back to the 12th century here, the foundations we found in the archives of the regional council, 12th century. The Rive d'Arche rag paper was made here, that very famous cotton rag paper in the 16th, 17th century, and then it became industrialized in the 18th century. So a lot of these factories are in danger of disappearing because the local authorities are not interested in the significance of the industry that has left and what the potential could be for these locations. So yeah, we have the dairy, the vacherie, the Moulin de Boissy and Moulin Sainte-Marie, and we have an idea. This is a dream. It's still looking like this. We have an idea, a dream to bring about a new life in this industrial complex through contemporary art. And here in the Moulin de Boissy, there's a very wonderful contemporary art gallery currently operating called the Continua Gallery. And they have a fantastic program of contemporary art and also pedagogic activities with the local schools. And busloads of children now come to the gallery to see the exhibitions and encounter the art and take part in workshops. And it has completely transformed, I must say, in the last 3 years, the access to contemporary art in this very rural region of Paris. Our neighbors have not gone to Paris before, and it's only 30 miles away. So we're talking about people very dislocated from contemporary culture. So that's one of our long-term projects, which we might get back to later. So I worked together with my partner, Jorge, and he began his artistic practice in Argentina during the 1970s military regime before moving to Paris in '83. And I left England in the 1980s with a fashion design degree to work in the Paris couture houses and gradually transitioned into contemporary art. And we co-founded Studio Orta in Paris in 1992 as an umbrella structure for this interdisciplinary team. And we now work between Paris and Les Moulins and all of these different studios and activities that we can operate from Les Moulins. And this is what our website looks like. And as Alan mentioned, we work across a diversity of medium. I won't go into all of those, but you can get a taste of them here. But I will be touching on some of these projects. But if we have time, there's also the food projects that I won't be talking about today. So Antarctica, Amazonia, the refuge ware, body architectures, the water project, connector structures, and mobility. And our work is widely exhibited in galleries and museums, but we strive to imagine all kinds of different artistic formats that speak different visual languages and operate within different contexts. So those are either within the white cube or the intimacy of the home, or outside in the playground of the public space, interacting with the wider community. Just get the hang of this text. So we could say that throughout our practice, we've been motivated by these three key questions. How can our practice, or how can art practice in general, pave a new critical role faced with the growing problems in the world? And how can it erase the contradictions between formal aesthetics and social function? And how can artworks empower and nurture constructive dialogue and contribute to human and environmental sustainability? Now, the term operational aesthetics was coined by the French art critic Nicolas Bourriaud, which suggests a movement towards a more functional aesthetic and operational ability of art. And he describes our art as operating on a plane where ethics and aesthetics find themselves sharing the same territory. It's not moving along. Here we are, do it manually. So the context of Jorge and my artistic counter was in the outbreak of the first Gulf War in 1990. And as a result, just under 2 million Iraqi and Kurds were displaced. This was migration on a scale that we've never seen before in real time. And the war, followed by the stock market crash, led to the devastating economic recession. And feeling an increased need to become more socially active, I began to explore a new creative medium to express the effects of social instability around me. As Alan said, I was a fashion designer. So, using my knowledge, the first visual manifestation was refuge wear, a dual response to the global crisis, the humanitarian aid appeals for shelter and clothing for the refugees fleeing the war zones, and at the same time, a response to the increasing numbers of homeless people living on the streets in Paris. The first sculpture I created was this one. It was the Habitent, a portable habitat designed for a minimum personal comfort and urgent mobility for nomadic populations. The habit implying a garment for meditation and a spiritual refuge. The inhabitant suggests a human presence as an occupant for the dwelling. And the aluminum-coated one-person tent with its telescopic armatures transforms in a matter of seconds to a wind and waterproof poncho. And using my design expertise, I went on to explore further shelters. These forms allow for the minimum vital space around the body, and the materials are chosen for their metaphorical properties. And we staged performances in the streets of Paris and New York that were broadcasted on TV to draw attention to the alarming situation unfolding in front of our eyes. I'm not sure whether you can see the text on the bottom. It's a kind of a timeline. This is 1995. And Jorge was invited to represent Argentina in the Venice Biennale with his Lightworks project. He created a series of ephemeral light paintings using the iconography created during workshops with children in the slums of South America and the homeless youngsters in Paris that I'd been working with. While the sumptuous festivities were taking place in the glittering Renaissance palaces you can see here along the Grand Canal, we presented our work from a canal barge, a floating pavilion, as a mobile platform to express the voices of the marginalized communities. At the same time, the war was ravaging in Rwanda. We were aware that such a prestigious gathering as the Biennale, our practice should take a new direction. We imagined the emergence of a new community devoid of conflict, where the frontiers become blurred, and where nations coexist more harmoniously, as a place for peoples fleeing their countries to escape political and social conflict or environmental disasters. And in fact, our idea is not so utopian. This community already exists. It's Antarctica. For the Biennale catalogue, Jorge published a draft proposal for the Antarctic World Nationality. Antarctica is governed by the treaty, the Antarctic Treaty, which was originally signed by 12 nations in 1959. It was the first peace treaty during the arms control agreement to be signed. And it declared that this sixth continent was a scientific reserve. It established the freedom for scientific investigation. It was an environmental protection zone, and there was a ban on all military activity. We imagined that back in 1995 that Antarctica would become this symbol of peace and unity to follow. And in fact, there are now 52 signatory nations signed up to the treaty, so from the 12 original ones in 1959. Each individual keeps an eye on and protects the life of the other. One individual's life depends on the life of the other. In Lucie's work, the warmth of one gives warmth to the other. The physical link weaves the social link. Urban philosopher Paul Virilio made this comment when I began physically connecting people together at the Venice Biennale. And the body of work, Nexus Architecture, is regarded as an emblem of our practice, nexus meaning a link or a bond, and here the symbolic content is more important than the functional. In this work, clothing becomes a medium through which social links and bonds make manifest, both literally and metaphorically. The links of zippers and channels, while enhancing uniformity of the workers' overalls, create androgynous shapes that defy classification by the usual social markers. It's an attempt to give form to the social, not the individual body. This is a segment of 16 suits created for the Venice Biennale and worn by architecture students throughout the opening days. The fabrics of the suits were inscribed with the same drawings that Jorge was projecting onto the Venetian facades, and also newspaper headlines reporting the Rwanda genocide. The connecting elements of the Nexus architecture are direct embodiments of the social link, a social sculpture worn in public spaces and used for ephemeral interventions around the world. And the recurring public manifestations of the work create a poetic series of interrelated segments, a symbol of unity, regardless of religion, sex, age, or social status. And these took places as you can see here, in South Africa and Australia and Mexico City for the World March Against Child Labour, etc., etc. Each intervention is documented as participants climb into the suits, zipper the nexus, walk, move in unison, creating an unusual closeness, questioning interdependence by being part of it, physical and visceral. And this is a connector. It's an architectonic infrastructure for social spaces. Sleeping bags, tents, ground sheets, rucksacks can attach and detach to each other. They form the basis of a mobile village where independence and interdependence are equally important. This connector village is a rhizome-like architectural configuration. The term rhizomatic defines our collaborative approach, where the premise is to produce new configurations and developments out of existing ideas and prototypes. It suggests a vision in which all vital manifestations are connected one to another, but individual identity is preserved, in a network of support in which every link, even the weakest, can serve to create new benefits for the community. This is 2003. And in 2003, the US invaded Iraq, and the Second Gulf War broke out. And we began working on the mobile intervention units around this time. These include customized ex-military trucks, such as the Savium lorries here, or the Red Cross ambulances, or even the smaller utilitarian vehicles, which are transformed into mobile units. They're kitted out with different types of equipment for emergency situations, from water filtering systems to temporary dormitories. The mobile unit is a basic module of self-sufficiency, capable of facilitating mobility and the autonomy of individuals. This is an exhibition in 2005, early 2005, but in December 2004, the tsunami in the Indian Ocean left 400,000 people homeless in 11 countries across Asia and Africa. Urban Lifeguard, as it's called, formed the central discourse to our exhibition at the Curve Gallery at the Barbican Centre in London. It's comprised of 23 suspended stretcher beds incorporating 60 figures. Here we reflect on the notion of the assistance and the assisted, whereby the body is not only understood as a measure of one's capacity to overcome ordeals or support others in distress, but also as a fragile structure to be preserved. A portable protest is a response to the second Iraq invasion in 2004. After a conflict which has lasted as long as the First World War, over 2 million Iraqis are in exile and a further 2 million are internally displaced. Commissioned by the Victoria and Albert Museum in London on the 25th of June 2007, just 5 days before the handover of sovereignty to the Iraqi government and the withdrawal of the US and the Allied forces, together with 50 volunteer performers, we staged a passive protest for peace. For over 2 hours, we silently meditated the future fate of Iraq and its citizens, amongst the tombs, sepulchres, and war trophies from historical battles and combats. Again, 2007. We were contacted by the curator of the End of the World Biennial, an important contemporary art event that was to take place in Ushuaia, on the southernmost tip of Argentina. As you can imagine, we were very excited. This was the closest we could possibly get to Antarctica. We proposed the idea to travel there, to found the Antarctic community. And thanks to these digital renders, the enthusiastic Biennale curators decided to support our endeavor, to help us realize the dream, which had been over 20 years in gestation. Back in our studio, we began feverishly drawing up ideas for a place to host this new community, a true global village. I began constructing dome tents based on earlier sculptures, temporary dwellings that can easily be folded and moved on. On their surface, a melting pot of nations, symbolized by the gloves and the fragments of clothing and flags. All we had to do next was find a place to pitch the Antarctic village. So during the spring of 2007, just before the ice pack becomes too thick for the icebreakers and the weather conditions too extreme to travel, the Lucie Orta team embarked on an incredible expedition aboard the Hercules KC-100 on a flight to Antarctica. We were finally able to stake the foundations of the Antarctic village, thanks to the support of the scientists stationed at the Marambio Argentine base camp. In the most extreme conditions, 4 ephemeral villages were constructed in different areas across the peninsula. Every human being has the right to move freely and cross the frontiers to their chosen territory. No individual should have the inferior status to that of capital, trade, communication, and pollution, all of which know or have no boundaries. This is our proposal amendment to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We call it Article 13.3. It's printed on each of the flags adorning the domes. Dotted across the continent, Antarctic Village pays homage to the populations that have been forced to flee danger, be it war, political persecution, or natural and economic disasters. Because of the extreme condition, Antarctica encourages international cooperation. It's a symbol of a community looking towards the future, and where the immaculate whiteness contains all the wishes for humanity and the messages of hope. As if they were filtered through a prism, our Antarctica flag condenses all the colors of the world. Like merging light, the whiteness becomes a snow and the innocence of dreams. The national identities hug each other, hand in hand, their borders merging into one. The flag is an emblem of unification, an extraordinary common identity of which we all form part of. On returning back to Europe, we were invited to exhibit the Antarctic Village in contemporary art galleries and museums internationally, and the lecturer published the monograph to coincide with the exhibition at the Hangar Bicocca in Milan. And we created new sculptures like these drop parachutes that reference the tools and objects of emergency rescue missions. In this case, the model is the kind of parachute utilized by humanitarian expeditions to rapidly distribute vital supplies. But our parachutes carry a very different message, such as water scarcity, or to restore lost social emotions of affection and solidarity. The lifeline resemble lifesavers, and they refer to both physical and material rescue and symbolically to the spiritual needs of man. We use textiles, silk screen print, and found utilitarian or personal objects. These are assembled together and suspended from the handcrafted steel frames. And no nation is complete without an identity document. And so we imagine the Antarctica World Passport that can be delivered from our passport bureaus. This first office was constructed from reclaimed furniture and supplies reminiscent of the makeshift post-frontier checkpoints that we've encountered along our travels. For the first Antarctica exhibition, we printed 10,000 copies of the passport, which were individually numbered and signed, stamped, declaring the right to travel freely and become a citizen of the world. Again, everybody has the right to move freely and circulate along their state borders to a territory of their choice. No individual should be deemed inferior status to that of capital, merchandise, communication, or pollution that traverse all borders. Due to the growing success of the Antarctic exhibition and publication, we were invited to create and install further passport offices throughout the world. This is in Greece for the Athens Biennial, where Greek citizens strolling along the Phalaura waterfront spontaneously joined the community. We've shifted territories here, you can tell. This is actually the same year, and this is how our practice interweaves. Parallel to the Antarctic project, we were commissioned to create new work by the Natural History Museum in London to coincide with the International Year of Biodiversity in 2010. And in order to comprehend the subject, we decided to embark on the expedition to the Amazon, an area which contains the most dense biodiversity per square foot in the world. And there's some citations on the bottom here. I'll go into those later. Interesting, we talked this morning about how we're perceived as artists. The scientists in the Marambio scientific base were very shocked that artists were there. And I'll explain a little bit that later on. But in this case, we were invited to take part in the expedition organized by the Environmental Change Institute and Cape Farewell, an arts organization. So the Environmental Change Institute from Oxford University requested that artists accompany them on their expedition and climate change research into the Amazon. So we were joined together with a number of scientists and artists here. And as we know, the Amazon is a fragile system, one which scientists believe under the pressure of climate change and other human impacts may reach a tipping point, which would have dramatic and unprecedented consequences when the forest system collapses. And research suggests that in the last 8,000 years, about 45% of Earth's original forest cover has disappeared, cleared mostly during the 20th century. So this is our expedition route from the Salsante Glacier, 15,000 feet, down through the cloud forest, the Troche Union, 8,000 feet, down through the Amazon basin, and to the Madre de Dios, the tributary to the Amazon, that's at 5,000 feet. And we became particularly interested in the Fondo Macedonia. Sorry for my Spanish accent. Please forgive me. It's a 650-hectare private reserve managed by the Crease Foundation. It's protected by Peruvian law. And it's in the cultural zone of the Mano Biosphere Reserve. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's the largest protected area in Peru. And here we decided to launch, together with the scientists, a work which we called Perpetual Amazonia. This is the reserve here, and this is the science lodge on the reserve. We delimited a hectare in this reserve, a hectare of land, so this is the hectare here, and collaborating with the scientists from ECI, we collected data and took soil samples. You can see us here, measured and tagged flora and fauna for the purpose of ongoing research. And we divided the hectare into 10,000 1-meter subplots, which is what we're doing here. And initially, we assigned one of our species photographs to each square meter of the plot. These are our species photographs, and I'm not sure that you'll be able to see it down there, but there is a label here with the UTM coordinates, Universal Transversal Mercator coordinates. These are the exact locations of the plot in the Amazon assigned to a species, but not necessarily from the Amazon. And at the subsequent exhibitions, we asked audiences how much they would pay for a meter squared. The question is it because it's an artwork, or is it because of the value of that natural environment on the well-being of our planet? Because the loss of nature comes at a price. So the project Perpetual Amazonia became an invitation to help forest research programs on this one designated hectare of land in the Amazon to be conserved into perpetuity, and to dedicate it to scientific research for the benefits globally. And all the money donated in exchange for the posters in the museum exhibitions was distributed to the ECI, Environmental Change Institute research programs. And then we went on to create, as we are very feverishly in our activity, working away in the studio, we went on to create further artworks in the Amazon series, and each artwork is accompanied by a 60-year certificate of moral ownership. The certificate decrees the rights to protect the plot and its biodiversity, and to contribute to the research, and at the same time an obligation to pass on the accumulated knowledge to a second generation. So of course this project poses many complex questions about ownership, indigenous land rights, and common rights of this natural heritage, as we know that the land is being expropriated or compulsory purchased from indigenous populations for the exploitation of the natural resources, and we know the effects of this daily devastation. And in the past 50 years, a third of the world's rainforests have been felled and burned, and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity states that in the last 8,000 years, about 45% of that original forest has disappeared in the last century. Or, as Wilson so eloquently states, destroying the rainforest for economic gain is like burning a Renaissance painting to cook a meal. These are some of our sketches from the project. And as we know, life on our planet is in constant flux, and there's been life for 3.5 billion years. And since then, there have been 5 mass extinctions, which have caused changes on Earth. And of course, those extinctions are a natural part of life, as we know, but the current rate of loss is about 100 to 1,000 times what it should be. The decline in living organisms has become known as the 6th mass extinction, and one distinguishing characteristic is that it's caused by humans. So here we are in the Natural History Museum casting dinosaur bones for our project, and we use this as a starting point and drawing from collaborations with the researchers in the paleontology department we created these Amazonia bone variations. And despite their colourful iridescent finish, they remain relics of death, a reminder of the many forms of life that have been shaped through evolution, giving us a tangible sense of the contemporary and the times of past. And in contrast, we also made these delicate sculptures in porcelain, cast from specimens, again in the collection. This is the elephant bird egg. I'm not sure that you have one in your vitrine in the office back there. It's about this size. As with all of our projects, we work over a minimum of 10 years exploring different materials and techniques of making, testing each time methods of dissemination. This work is called Seeds, and it's composed of larger-than-life glass seed pods and pollen framed by hundreds of watercolor drawings that make up a metaphorical seed bank. These seeds are made in collaboration with the glassblowers in Murano in Venice. And the fragile quality of the glass and the length of time that it takes to make each seed adds to the quality of this work, the intricate beauty and the diversity of the species, often invisible to the human, in an act of preserving varieties that may be threatened with extinction. Meanwhile, back to the Antarctic passport. This is 2012. So the Passport Office continued to travel across Europe. The Jardin des Plantes in Paris, this is the Passport Office. As you can see, the queues, a huge success, young people, tourist families, asylum seekers all coming together around the bureau. And we had to print 2 more editions of Passport, so totaling now 55,000 copies of the Passport in preparation for the exhibition in the Shanghai Biennial. And we were literally mobbed during the opening, and sadly the authorities kindly request that we close the office due to excess requests to become a citizen of the world. Had to be closed. So with these 55,000 passports in circulation and more people queuing to obtain one, it was obvious that we could no longer fumble with our archaic artistic methods. We had to find a way to innovate, and technology is not one area that we are masters in or have any knowledge of, unlike the other materials that we've been working in. So in 2012, I was invited to become a fellow at MIT, and we began collaborating with the designers and programmers to imagine an online Antarctica World citizen database that would have the potential to unite thousands more citizens and give them a voice. So these are the early screen captures of that database that we developed. Around this time, the civil war erupted in Syria. The Zaatari refugee camp opened in July 2012 to host the Syrians fleeing violence. And in 2015, over 80,000 refugees were living in this camp. Due to the conflict in Syria, an estimated 12 million people have been displaced, and the figures are increasing every day. And also beyond the cultural sector, we received invitations to present this work at the LH Social and Economic Forum, which brings together citizens, political decision makers, and business leaders, as well as NGOs, who are keen to be involved in the dynamics of a positive economy. And this is the Nansen Initiative, a global consultation forum for the development of cross-border solutions for the rights of displaced persons due to climatic disasters. And the Nansen consultation took place in Geneva. Down here, it brought together 350 delegates from 114 organizations, including NGOs, world governments, and ministerial delegates. It was here that we learnt of the legal position concerning persons displaced by climate-induced disasters who are not eligible for refugee status and therefore lack basic human rights. On the bottom here, the Swiss ambassador, maybe the same Swiss ambassador, that Ted and Fono were working with. No, who was working with the Swiss ambassador? Somebody this morning? No. Somebody mentioned him this morning. There he is. And the State Secretary of Norway. He's not yet, there he is there. And Minister of Ghana, alongside ministers and NGOs from many other countries experiencing cross-border displacement, Somalia, Philippines, Alaska, etc., all signed up eagerly for the passport. And we heard later that one of the delegates had adopted the Article 13.3 as his government position, and we suspect it was this chap. He's the Interior Minister for Iraq, and you can tell by his grin. And we thought that, by this point, we thought that social networks may provide the ideal platform for our community to grow and maybe even solicit them to a call for action. For this reason, we developed an IT partnership with Greenflex, a French consultancy company specialized in sustainable IT development services. And this collaboration has enabled us to bring together passport holders that have already signed up for their passport and allows people to be able to log in and collect their passport online. And we launched this platform at the COP21 Climate Summit in Paris, in December 2015. And here we are at the COP. And another turning point in our practice, the Antarctica's immaculate landscape has now become a powerful symbol of global warming. Melting ice caps are the primary factor in rising sea levels, and they're expected to rise 1 meter by 2100. The Antarctic continent contains 75% of the planet's fresh water, of which 90% is ice. Antarctica has begun its irreversible decline. And geographic transformations and displacement of communities induced by climate change, especially along coastal zones or in desert regions, are redefining our local and global borders. As climate change crosses all borders and is affecting every region of the world without distinction, it's clear that faced with this global phenomenon, our reaction should be united without borders. In order to become a world citizen, you have to agree with certain obligations, act in favor of sustainable development through simple daily acts, that's easy enough, defend natural environments under threat as a global public resource, fight against climate change generated by human activity, support humanitarian actions aiding displaced persons of the world, share values of peace and equality, and also cherish your passport as a symbol of your personal engagement and impart these obligations to future generations. So this was a screen capture the other day. We have 17,000 people, more than 17,000 signed up, but there are a lot more passports in circulation because we didn't collect all the citizen data from the early projects. So if you do want a passport, there's a barcode here. I also have some copies with me that we can collect during the break. Become a world citizen. So as we know, the Paris Climate Agreement came into force in last November. And what does this mean for climate-induced migration? The International Office for Migration projects that climate change is expected to trigger growing population movements with and across borders as a result of such factors as increasing intensive extreme weather events, sea level rise, and acceleration of environmental degradation. Climate change will have adverse consequences for livelihoods, public health, food security, and water availability. And it will impact human mobility and lead to a substantial rise in the scale of migration and displacement. The UNHRC predict climate change-induced migration to increase from 25 million to 1 billion in the next 30 years. 25 million to 1 billion. I've ended that, sorry, on a very negative note. But it does conclude my presentation, but hopefully I'll give you food for thought, and please do sign up for a passport. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to ask our presenters from this session to join Anna Arabinden Kessen at the front of the room. Anna will be our moderator. She is an assistant professor of African American and Black diasporic art with a joint appointment in the Department of African American Studies here at Princeton. She specializes in African American, Caribbean, and British art with an emphasis on histories of race, empire, and transatlantic visual culture in the long 19th century. Her current book project, The Currency of Cotton, Art, Empire, and Commerce, 1780 to 1900, draws on her prize-winning dissertation using the visual and material culture of the 19th century cotton trade. Please welcome Anna. And forward to this conversation very much. Take it away.
It's freezing. It's freezing. It's freezing.
I think we have 20 minutes.
It's Antarctica in here.
30 minutes.
Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna open it up to questions in this similar kind of format that. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. I'll have it really close. Sorry. I'm going to open this up to questions in the similar format that Rob provided earlier this morning. But I just wanted to maybe begin the conversation by asking a very broad question to all three of you, because there is so much overlap in really interesting ways in your talks and your projects. But I'm particularly interested in how all three of you were talking about these ideas around citizenship as a kind of community formation and as a kind of free movement, or that paralleled the displacements we're seeing taking place through climate change. And I just wondered, sort of, what maybe the three of you could speak about some of the ways your conceptions of this relationship might converge or move apart before we start the discussion.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'll begin. So, you know, in philosophy and in ethics, there's been this recurring idea of a cosmopolitan citizenship, or the idea that we're, you know, citizens of the world, as well as citizens of particular places. And one of the challenges has been that global citizenship, for many people, seems rootless, and that one doesn't know where one then exercises one's citizenship. And there's something to that. We have found the idea of a more global or a more expansive idea of citizenship in our region very useful, almost in a negative sense. It detaches people from local affiliations that become too thick. So it's a way to sort of think more expansively about interests that aren't myopic. In our case, at the scale of the region, seems to encompass the problems and challenges that we face at the border. So we've tried to open people up to a more expansive idea of care, a more expansive idea of intervention, without becoming unmoored from local context, without becoming unmoored from territory and so forth. So I think the idea of a more global or expansive idea of citizenship is very useful, but it certainly doesn't replace the more local and rooted idea of where one acts and where one is most capable of acting and where one is most knowledgeable about the problems they face. So it's always, I think, a correspondence between local and global, at least when it comes to motivation and why people.
And if I can just add to that, I think that has been our interest, is to really amplify a more cultural dimension of citizenship, that it is not a designation that is symbolically inscribed, but it's actually a praxis, and in that sense it's performed. And I think this really extends a lot of our interest in radical pedagogies, in the sort of philosophies and approaches or strategies of Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal, where knowledge in this case cannot just be imposed. It's almost like if human rights, we can just put them in a list and they become mandates, but it is not until they are performed experientially that they begin to mobilize a very different agenda of justice in our case. So I think that this is a collision between the symbolic and the performative, I think, that we've been interested in that sense, in the activation of local sensibilities through praxis and less through, I mean, even though passports are important to us in the symbolic nature of it, it was really, at least in our performance, it was the act of crossing and the way that enabled the community to to confront itself, I think what opened up a very interesting idea of citizenship.
I think what we found with our Antarctica World Citizenship, what has become apparent is that there is the possibility, of course, to have this global citizenship through the passport, the symbolic document, but actually the signing up of citizens, in that process, we've recorded their either their place of birth or where they're living. We give that an option to be where would you like to perform your actions as citizens, because, okay, you can have this global identity, but more importantly, how will you connect to others in your community to be able to activate your rights as citizens? And I didn't mention it, but on the citizen map, you could see that when you sign up, you can add your, and we've had questions about what do? Do we add our birthplace, or do we add the place where we're living? So it will actually be more effective if you added the place where you're living now, where you can be active as citizens. So you can see those citizenships, the little dots on the map there, using these tracking applications. Now that we can actually track where the citizens are and which cities, so you can zoom in and we can see our citizens in the Pacific. And we have many citizens at the moment asking for passports from Kurdistan and Morocco and also the Philippines, and that plays into question as well, what is the passport form? We've had many questions about, well, is it a real document? And we go back and say, no, this is an artistic project. And they come back to us and say, well, it's a really great idea, we still want it, even if it's... So we have a feeling that there's... people adhere to this idea of it being the symbolic, at the same time the global, and at the same time being the local. And I think where we struggle at the moment is, well, where do we take this citizenship now? We have this kind of responsibility for these citizens of 55,000 or more, etc. And the citizens, and that's what we found at the COP, were asking us, well, what can we do? How can we activate our rights? And I think that's the next stage that we need to work on, but it's going beyond our capability as artists. So it's thinking about how to mobilize the communities into actions which, as you talked about, are localized, because in fact you can have most effective activity in your local community.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to open it up now. I think I'll copy what Rob did. So we'll have maybe 3 questions at a time, and then the artists can decide which questions they want to.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your inspiring presentations, and even more so for the inspiring work that you're doing. And it really hit home for me because I have a big problem. The problem I've got is part of a group of people who are currently engaged in the revitalization of Trenton, New Jersey, which is only 7 miles down the road, a lot closer than Tijuana is to San Diego. We are faced with, and if you were to drive down Route 1, you wouldn't have to go through canyons, you wouldn't have to pass a wall, and you wouldn't have a border check. But it's 2 completely different worlds. But as part of the revitalization effort, we've identified the arts. And I'm pleased to say that I'm here today with 3 of our artists, the Trenton Community A-Team, which is an outgrowth of the Trenton Area Soup Kitchen. And we are using art as a fundamental feature and now have a building in Trenton that backs up to the largest crack house in Trenton. What can we learn? Now, in our situation's a little different, right? I mean, you've got what I would regard as a bigger, language issues. You've got money flowing into Tijuana. Medical device industry is huge. But we have the pharmaceutical sector here. Bringing in funds is important, engaging with the university, and Princeton does engage with the community. We have a communiversity at the end of spring every year, but that communiversity is about town of Princeton and university in Princeton. It doesn't move all the way to Trenton. We have the opportunity to leverage art in all sorts of ways and are doing that. And the revitalization recognizes this. We're the first building in Trenton to get dedicated to the arts as part of this revitalization. So I'm wondering, like, what some of the similarities and differences might be that we might be encountering, and some metrics that would be helpful, like how much money, is there a budget? What's the size we're talking about that would be required to that is being used now to accomplish your objectives, and how do you measure your success? What's sort of the metrics? The rate at which violence has gone down, the number of affordable houses that are created, jobs calculate. I mean, what are you using to see success?
Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
I was really interested in the refugeware project, and I was wondering, also the mobile vans, and I was wondering what sort of use they were put to, or sort of what happened. Were they used in any way? And I think in some ways the citizenship question about the passport as a symbolic document, you kind of answered that, but just to think through how sort of the relationship between art and function in the kind of justice, environmental justice activism framework works, and if there are limitations to it and so on. Thanks.
Thanks.
I'm curious as to what was the motivation or the initiation of your various projects. In other words, were they self-initiated, where you had gone into these communities and became aware of the injustice and formulated a project, or were you approached by a group that was within that community who had created the idea and farmed it out to you, or partnered with you, or what was the, how did the projects germinate?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Wow, there's a lot there.
Ooh. You want? Should we just jump in?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the questions. They're obviously hugely complex. Let's try to sort of tackle a few issues. Obviously, one first thing that I can say for the first question is that the conditions that we encounter in our own border region obviously are reproduced everywhere, and that's the first thing to be aware of. I mean, I've been, in fact, saying that, well, in the public's imaginary right now, the border is really a site of criminalization and polarization, obviously a place of huge inequality. That is reproduced in many American neighborhoods, and we have to begin by understanding and sort of being humble enough to say that we suffer from the same conditions, that violence is reproduced in Ferguson, in Chicago, and in many communities across this nation. So how to confront inequality is a fundamental point of departure. In our case, the most political aspect of our work is to really enable that priority to really guide our work. And also the kinds of curatorial sort of efforts that we engage in terms of a cross-sector type of synergy, that these problems cannot be tackled by just only one agency, but they need a kind of, they require new forms of cross-institutional collaborations, which is not foreign to our own history in this country. I think the New Deal and the kinds of Bill of Rights, the robust investments in infrastructure, public space, public art, public education, it's been part of our ethos, and I don't know why we forgot how, in a more robust way, across institutions, we invested at some point in the public imagination, So to begin with, is a way of reconnecting things, and art serves an incredible sort of purpose here, and in our case, if I don't want to sound strange about it, but it's a very particular approximation to what we understand as the potential of art and culture as engines. In this case, it's not really about art productions as things that can be obviously part of our, city, public space, public art, murals, a lot of the kind of cultural material that must be part of our everyday interactions. But for us, art is more about an instrument of community engagement. So it's really a kind of excuse somehow, a kind of way of enabling new forms of participation. And so in that sense, I think we have been very lucky with our partners, in communities that we work with, where we have been strategizing ways through which artists can really conceive new ways of summoning a new type of conversation. In fact, when we got this grant from the California State Commission, Energy Commission, we argued that that climate action cannot be only engaged through energy technology, but it needs to be paired with new forms of community engagement and environmental education. So there is a pedagogical and kind of dimension of art in this case that is essential to us. And finally, I think in this first question, but is connected to the others, this is about how do we produce a new form of trust across institutions, which is really the legacy for us of Bogota, Colombia, where the university and the community, which at times are at odds with one another, and also obviously many other institutions, how do we intervene in producing new forms a new type of coalition, basically. And so I think there is an opportunity in many of these environments where obviously there are clear borders between jurisdictions that have resources and those that do not, how to produce new synergies, I imagine. That's the reason I think we believe the university has the capacity to elevate a community capacity here. And at times in our case, it began by identifying who are those actors. It's almost that what is really a kind of compendium of agencies that are already doing things and connecting them with the efforts that the university is doing in relationship to those topics, let's say. So a lot of our projects that are very localized, again, begin with visualizing the civic and community infrastructure that while every nonprofit, every group, every collective is been struggling to survive, at times they don't recognize each other, and that somebody has to come in to be a kind of mediator in order to really produce that link, let's say. So we believe in the role of the artist as a mediator of cross-institutional coalitions, basically, in this case.
And another way of saying this is, for us, it's always about a convergence of bottom-up capacities in communities, which are rich, but often off the radar of top-down institutions. And there's a kind of skepticism in community activist work, and we're very embedded in that, that's very anti-institutional, and we're not. We actually want to hold institutions accountable for engaging equitably in development in cities. And the most compelling models for us across the world, required, and they entailed a kind of committed leadership that was cultivating and enabling all of this bottom-up energy to actually emerge and have impact in their neighborhoods. And this includes the university. I don't know if the projects that you're doing with Trenton are university-based, if you're doing university-based projects at all?
Princeton's involved.
Princeton. See,
but more on the board level.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
we get to really see that.
Sure. I mean, we, in our case, we do border work, but we also do a lot of work in Southeast San Diego, which are sort of marginalized neighborhoods that have been off the radar of municipal planning sort of institutions forever. And one of the challenges that we've had is that when universities do, and museums and others, institutions with power and resources, when they do projects in collaboration with neighborhoods like this, it's often framed as a charitable activity or a humanitarian activity, where the institution has all the resources and all the knowledge, and the communities are these empty vessels waiting to be filled with, noblesse, And yeah, so, and Teddy mentioned this in the talk, we've been trying to tip that to a more horizontal plane where we're facilitating partnerships. And Teddy and I were actually very fortunate. About 4 years ago, we were summoned by the mayor of San Diego to come and work with him in his office to figure out how to create more horizontal flows between the municipality and underserved neighborhoods in the region. So we were very fortunate that we sort of had this base of the mayor's office to actually, penetrate. But
that's true.
Okay. But again, it's the convergence of many actors. Yeah.
Yes, going back to your point, Ted, about and refugeware and the objects functioning, we see the work more as like catalyst, as activating the possibility in others to be able to do things. Steve mentioned the residue effect, that the things we make can offer a potential for other things to happen, and the fact that they're semi-functional, look functional, it allows people to approach it in a way where they're not fearful of the object. It's something that is understandable, could be. It's this idea of the potentiality of something, allowing somebody else to take on the idea and implement it elsewhere. So this trigger, or the catalyst, art being a trigger. In the case of refugeware, I began working with the homeless shelter, the Salvation Army, and the director of the Salvation Army wanted me to work on a number of ideas with the homeless people, but in fact, at that time, the refugeware body architecture was highly criticised, and it was a really difficult time to be able to understand what to do with it. I was kind of breaking out as an artist, leaving the design world, and I decided not to commercialize or turn it into a product that could be utilitarian and functioning, specifically for the reason that I felt that generating more ideas was more useful, and that this may not be the solution, but other things, if we generate more and more and more, perhaps there are other solutions along the way which are more feasible or more better for society in a way. Other than that, I know that today you've probably seen there's a young woman in Detroit, I believe, that's making convertible tents, sleeping bags, etc., very similar. And she's working with a number of homeless job seekers to be able to produce and manufacture. So I think there has been a ripple-down effect. And at the time, 1992, this was really early on, we didn't imagine that people would be living on tents in the streets. And we know now today, you've seen the pictures in our Parisian streets as well. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people are camping out in communities across the cities. So it has become a phenomenon that there are responses needed, and the young people are responding in really interesting ways. And I set up a master program at the Design Academy in Eindhoven, actually in 2002, to address these questions. Design, social design, ethical design. It was called Man and Humanity. So how can man respond to humanitarian, environmental, in ways, how can design help assist, accompany communities locally, personally, in our development locally and also globally. So that was back in 2002. It was the first sustainable design program to be initiated. Now they're popping up all over the place, so thankfully, thankfully, yeah. And sustainability and design is being embedded in curriculum at very early, in very early days, from foundation level now. And of course, I work at the University of the Arts in London, and it's very important in our university, sustainable thinking, which was unheard of 20 years ago. So, a lot of progression.
I'm sorry, I just one last thought, because I forgot something that I wanted to mention to the Trenton case, but also the issue of how we began many of these efforts. And I think it's obviously a huge act of masochism, because many of these projects obviously take a long time. It's just so impressive to see the evolution of projects. But a lot of these efforts with these partners that we've developed began with really co-producing with them a lot of research about the border. And so our relationship was really about a more organic sort of conversation that emerged through time, and incrementally it really enabled us to begin framing a lot of those efforts with the community stations agenda, let's say. So what I'm trying to say is that it is about building trust with those communities, mainly when institutions, particularly universities, just come in and out, and promises are made, and there's no longevity, let's say, in those partnerships. So it's really very much a legacy. That's the reason we decided to embed ourselves in this border region in a more embedded condition. But one aspect that I would like to mention, because it's important in this issue of redevelopment, you know, and how environmental issues today need to not only be connected to social sustainability, but also economic sustainability, that not only private developers are the ones leading the development of the city, that communities can also be the developers of their own housing stock, of public space, and that in fact many agencies embedded in those communities have track records, have trajectories, have budgets. Architects like us, we discovered that our own fees as architects are already collateral for a construction loan. 10% of our fees tend to be, as architects, 10% of the construction cost. And if we begin to create a compendium of supports and financial flows, we have been arguing, and we are proving this, that the developer's pro forma, in terms of economic development, can be a site of intervention by synergizing many of these capabilities and the kind of equity that universities bring and so on. So what I'm trying to say is really that we believe that a lot of this discussion has to be moved towards a more economic dimension, where communities can be sustainable not only environmentally but socially and economically by owning their own modes of productivity. These marginalized neighborhoods that we worked with in the past and throughout these years, we have declared them sites of production as opposed to urbanizations of consumption and display. And I think that we can prove that a new form of economic development can occur here. And our partners, for example, in Earth Lab, this 4-acre environmental classroom, are excited because they see economic development, while not materializing in terms of profit right away. They see that the black community and the Hispanic community who lives there will have access to new career pathways, so that what is expected of these kids is just to flip burgers in a fast food chain, when in reality, by having access to these new forms of education, they can begin to aspire to larger kind of endeavors. So I think that enabling them to be the stewards of their own environment will eventually trickle down, in a sense, to produce a new form of economic sustainability. So I want to argue for an economic dimension to a lot of our efforts.
Socially engaged, and that you don't produce objects that are inert, aesthetic objects for the market or whatever. They're engaged works, and yet the work is so visually engaging. It's beautiful. It's mesmerizing and colorful. And I wonder if that is a deliberate strategy of engagement, or does that ever get in the way of its utility by distracting attention even from the end goal? A weird question, but
no,
I mean, you're artists too.
Shall I start this time?
Yes,
yeah, start this time. It wasn't an example I show, but I like to recount it each time. In the food projects, we stage dinners and lunches, all kinds of communities. There is no limit to the numbers. The last one was 500 people, and we've got projects for thousands of people, community dinners. And actually the first meal, this was back in 2000, 17 years ago, as part of the project, we produce beautiful dinner plates, porcelain dinner plates, very precious objects. They're made in Limoges. This is the birthplace of the porcelain in the Occident. They're just fine objects, dowry objects they used to be. That there's a decline in the industry, and we're also supporting the Limoges porcelain manufacturers through this project, as it turns out, 17 years later. So as part of the dinner projects, we create each time dinner plates as a relational object to trigger conversations across the dinner table. But they're also objects that we've seen that people cherish, they take away with them as a reminder of that encounter, that something special has happened. And the community in Dieuze, in a rural town in the northeast of France, we met with community stakeholders, and we told them about the idea of creating the dinner plates. It was a meal for 3,000, hold on, how many was it? 3,000 people, yeah, it was a dinner for 3,000 people. That's the whole community, the whole population of Dieuze. Actually, 750 people came to this dinner. 750 people came. I'll tell you why. So we said we're going to produce these beautiful plates, and they said, well, wait a minute, that's going to cost us too much. why can't we just use paper plates? Yeah? But first of all, we told them, well, you're not paying for it, so don't worry, so we're going to do it anyway. Somebody else is paying for it. It was an arts organisation outside of the community, not in the same town, so money wasn't coming out of the la caisse, that's a French word, from the mayor's office. And so we staged the table, we set it up for 3,000 people. It ran from the salt mine to the mayor's office, and 750 people came from all walks of life. And we learnt that amount came because 750 plates were sold on the day. So it was proof of the pie is in the eating, that producing those plates was really important to the event, although there had been so much opposition in the early days of the development of the project with the community. So yeah, it was a beautiful object, going back to the idea of what is it beautiful is, has quality. People recognized the beauty in that, but they also recognized in the memory of the event that something special had taken place. It wasn't a picnic in the main square.
Even those the dinosaur bones that you made were very beautiful.
Exactly. Children were climbing all over them, but in that climbing all over them, there were other messages that they were taking away with them. So it allows a kind of a sense of an approachability as well to the work, which we talked about earlier on, this idea of the function. I know that it's something that you can touch and manipulate, and that gives you access, in a sense, to the messages that may be emitted from the work.
I mean, I think for us it's very much the same. I mean, we've trained our students, obviously, to produce beautiful objects, and they're technically very skilled. But for us, it's about understanding the context in which the object operates, and the impact that the object has on audiences and unsuspecting groups that may not be in one's radar. And we've actually realized how powerful aesthetically beautiful objects can be in marginalized conditions. And for us, the greatest model of this is the city of Medellin, Colombia, which was, the home of Escobar. It was this incredibly dangerous, violent place, and a series of very inventive, imaginative mayors worked with local artists and renowned global architects to invest incredible public resources in the most marginalized zones of the city. So you have these beautiful structures, these library parks that are sort of in the periphery of the city of Medellin. And when you talk to people there, the impact that these objects of beauty had in neglected neighborhoods, this sense that, wow, I mean, this is mine, and maybe somebody actually does value me. I mean, it's an amazing kind of it's an amazing agent in communities like that.
And when we worked with this former mayor of Medellin, and he told us that one of the first acts, really, after taking the office of the mayor, was to ask what were the most underrepresented, really disenfranchised, marginalized communities. And the planner, the director of planning, showed him the map of the city, and it was obviously the rings surrounding the city, all the favelas, all the informal settlements. And he said, well, in the next 4 years, we're going to shift our gaze, and we're going to move from the center to these sites, and we're going to invest, again, in a very robust way. So that act of really shifting the gaze we found to be one of the most political acts. But again, this is very pertinent to your question, because at the end of the day, I think the three of us are working with topics that, just by immersing ourselves in the complexity of those topics, already aesthetics begin to take a very different condition. So in a sense, site matters. In other words, the sites, where we intervene, and how the complexity of those processes embedded them there, right? Social, economic, political, environmental, already by default contaminate. By that I mean positively our own artistic procedures. And so I'm thinking that, in fact, we've been critic of architecture, of our own field, because it's been obsessed for a long, long time with aesthetics for aesthetics' sake, without opening in a more vulnerable to that, to that complexity. And in many ways, the profession of architecture has been guilty of just simply camouflaging with aesthetics the exclusionary policies really that have marginalized communities.
So a big debate right now in the architecture community is whether we should participate with the new administration in making the wall more beautiful. And so we were actually asked to be on a jury about a year ago. A foundation in New York opened up a competition. Just in case Trump would win, we need to be ready to, And we said, no, we won't be a jury on that. But now there's an actual RFP out by the federal government, a business opportunity to build a design-build structure on the.
We've been
And so, there's been a kind of boycott against beautifying the structure. Yeah, we don't want to beautify the structure. I mean, we want to keep it ugly and an object of state power. I mean, let's engage it differently.
I have an idea for you there.
Yeah. So this is a position that we took in the context of that competition. We said that to be to do that would be to be complicit, obviously, with the institutions that have perpetuated what is ethically and morally wrong. And even though initially as an architect I wanted to maybe say, well, what else can the world be? But the discussion was not really oriented to that question. I think that the whole discussion was how to beautify it. And as we showed in our presentation, Kevin Lynch, this famous urbanist, has suggested reinterpreting the border not as a wall or that is beautified, but as an infrastructural system that can manage resources, that can be shared by the two cities. So obviously political boundaries can be other than just the kind of flat line that divides jurisdictions. So yes, an infrastructural way of thinking regionally would be a different agenda. But at this moment, in the context of the xenophobic agendas that really are forwarded by this administration, we wanted to take a position and say no. To build a border wall is to perpetuate those policies.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful
Thank
presentation.
you.